So are we starting?
Yeah, I think we can start.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So this talk is going to be about HPC and workflow languages. It's actually based on a paper, an educational paper I wrote called 15 Quick Tips for Success with HPC, responsibly bashing that Linux cluster, which is published in PLoS, Public Library of Science. And that's the first part, and the second part will be standardization of pipelines using workflow languages. It's going to be quite a high-level talk, and I started in November at UCL, and I've only just got my Myriad account on Friday afternoon. So presumably a lot of you guys are going to be well up to speed with a lot of these things, but it's just generally a high-level overview of kind of practices that would keep you in good stead with HPC. So my background is I did a 4-year integrated master's of pharmacy and chemistry with a focus on neurochemistry, that's designing drugs for neurodegenerative diseases at St. George's Hospital Medical School. Then I did a PhD in distributed computing and molecular biology. In particular, I was looking at transcriptomes. That's the expression of all the that's the expression of all the nucleic acids and genetic sequences that go to encode proteins. And that's I wonder if you could mute. Yeah, good stuff. Okay, yeah, so that's transcriptomes are kind of important because we can detect when certain genes get expressed, turned on or off in certain conditions. And that was using distributed computing because that generates large data. Then I worked in scientific computing at the ICR, Institute of Cancer Research, as a research software engineer on HPC, helping people build computational pipelines and run them on HPC. I did a postdoc at Imperial on DNA storage. That's actually encoding data inside DNA. So looking at encoding algorithms to convert convert data, encode it with a payload to facilitate error correction when you read back from the noisy DNA. And another project I was simultaneously doing was looking at viral insertions into human genomes projects, 100,000 genomes project with Genomics England. So 15 quick tips for HPC. So number one, do the HPC induction. So I'm actually coming back from lunch to find your email box flooded with 83,000 emails from 97,000 jobs. The remaining 14,000 went to my sysadmin, Bob. That was my first day with HPC. Bob was discombobulated. Why? I didn't read the docs for LSF, which is what they were using at Royal Holloway, and the O parameter is the output parameter where you specify where to write the job. And if that's not set, the LSF was configured to automatically send you a job report. Now I'd submitted 97,000 small structure computational jobs, and I didn't specify the O parameter, so I got 97,000 emails. Most institutions offer induction training and manuals on their intranets. Helps you avoid embarrassing mistakes and encourages responsible use of the HPC system, thereby minimizing impact on other users. And docs usually have examples of common job submission and management tasks. So number two, brush up on your Linux commands and Bash. So Bash is a shell providing access to the operating system services. Areas of focus that you could look at are things like streaming, piping, and redirection for controlling input and output from running processes. Environmental variables for setting and sharing parameters between software and operating system. And compression and archiving for managing large files and optimizing storage. And that's particularly useful when you've got large numbers of small files, which we'll touch up on in another data tip. Regular expressions is also a useful one for powerful search and base operations. There's lots of useful online tutorials and articles available. Tip number 3, don't run your commands on the login node. So typically one or more of the login nodes are reserved for logging onto the cluster and submitting jobs to the scheduler. The login node may be used for non-intensive tasks such as editing source code and job submission scripts. This kind of setup ensures that load on the cluster is properly balanced by the job scheduler running on the master node. So logging into individual nodes to run jobs directly on them is bad practice and usually isn't permitted because then it makes the cluster unstable. And the reason for that is logging nodes are typically lightweight VMs which aren't released at all for running intensive tasks. So doing so slows the logging nodes for other users and causes delays logging in. And such tasks might be terminated without prior notice. So if you run a job and you go away thinking it's running in the background, it might be terminated. So the solution to that is to use an interactive shell session. And that's initiated on one of the compute nodes. But what happens is when you start a shell session, the job scheduler will allocate you one or more nodes to run your interactive shell session. And it's as if you're running just a normal batch session, but you have that extra compute power. And it's all scheduled by the job scheduler. So it responds to ad hoc commands and scripts in the session. And that's ideally what you like. That's ideally what you should do if you'd like to just use Bash on the HPC and have the extra compute power. So it's used for slightly more intensive tasks, for instance, compiling code on the HPC or recursively finding files. Tip 4, don't wait for cluster load to decrease to submit jobs. So HPC batch schedulers are designed to simultaneously accept multiple job submissions from multiple users. Actually, this tip came from one of the reviewers of my paper, actually. I didn't think it was that amazing tip, but they wanted me to put it in there. So to get the paper published, I just go along with it. So these jobs are placed in a queue or partitions to be scheduled for execution. Jobs submitted during increased cluster load will be held in a queue until conditions allow them to run. So there's no need really to wait for the load to decrease before submitting your job. So submit your job and just relax. The next one is to be aware of the file system. And that's because HPC systems use distributed file systems across their nodes. And that's necessary because each of the running processes needs to be able to access files that might be across multiple nodes. So they use a distributed file system, which also provides redundancy. So there's mirroring of the data, and that allows you to bring the compute to the data also. So typical distributed file systems are Lustre, GPFS, HDFS, and Hadoop Spark. Distributed file systems are not optimized for large number of very small files. That's the main takeaway for this tip. And Scratch Space is temporary storage that's available locally on nodes for computation. But importantly, Scratch Space is shared with other users. So you should really follow the HPC guidelines and obey recommended quotas. And the other thing I'd say about distributed file systems is it's quite amazing, they're quite resilient. I built a simple 4-node Hadoop cluster, and I mistakenly used the dd command in Linux, which allows you to clone a disk, because I wanted to make another node. I accidentally erased one of my node's drives, but because there was a replication factor of 3, the other 3 nodes were able to reconstitute the data that was on the 4th node that I messed up. So that's why, distributed file systems are pretty useful, especially in Hadoop and Spark, because they can reconstruct the data if one of the nodes goes down. Tip 6, manage large file transfers carefully. So transferring large files into and out of HPC clusters is kind of common in research, particularly in the area I work, which is next generation sequencing data. I should have really updated this for economics. What sort of large data sets do you guys use in economics? Do you have a particular types of?
There you go. somebody who has a data set that is maybe 300 plus gigabytes, but
All right, yeah.
I don't know what he does.
Sure, sure. So with the next generation sequencing data, that's the data that you get from a DNA sequencer. So when you sequence the whole human genome in full, the whole human genome occupies about 1 terabyte of data for one person. So the 100,000 genomes was 107,000 genomes. That's one of the projects I worked on at Imperial, and that's 1 terabyte per genome. So that's quite big data. So to facilitate that, HPC nodes typically have high-speed network interconnects or fabric, it's typically InfiniBand, but bandwidth is finite and shared by all users. So some systems, HPC systems, provide designated gateway nodes for file transfers into and out of HPC clusters. So use those for file transfers. Follow defined procedures or commands for file transfers, usually in the docs. Or consider using specialized file transfer software, for example, Globus, Aspiria Connect, or BBCP.
I think UCL has Globus.
Yes. Yeah, it's very ubiquitous now for it's been around for many years. They used to use Grid, but now they're moving towards cloud.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So scheduled transfer, as another tip, is to schedule transfers during periods of low cluster activity. Or you can also ask HPC support for assistance, giving them a heads up so they can kind of help. Be aware of any recharge model. So some institutions operate a recharge model, building research groups for HPC usage. I think there's most institutions like this. Typically, CPU usage is charged in CPU hours for CPU time used, and storage charges are typically billed in terabytes per year. This is kind of general, right? You probably have to look up to UCL. Surprised it was much different. Jobs are often submitted with a project code to identify a research group project. And therefore, recharge model is in place, especially if submitting intensive or long duration jobs or exceeding disk quota. And if you need to exceed disk quota, the best thing is to get in support. Tip 8, do not use Unicode characters in file paths. So avoid using uncommon Unicode characters and spaces in file names or paths. So as to avoid problems with, other users accessing your files, or difficulties for HPC support during non-automated operations like backups. They can often fail if the Unicode characters break certain scripts. And it also simplifies migrations, file transfers, and routine housekeeping tasks. Tip 9, understand the levels of parallelism required by your job. So essentially, that's the level of granularity, coarse level or very fine level granularity of parallelizing jobs. And that really depends on the computational, it really depends on the programs that you're calling within your pipeline. They might have options for hyper-threading, or they might have options for multi-threading, as well as running those multi-threaded programs in parallel on different nodes. Some form of mixed model that they're using. A lot of computational biology applications and protein docking that tends to have multiple levels of parallelism for efficiency. So understanding the parallelism in jobs is good to allow you to leverage increased throughput by understanding levels of parallelism in executing computational tasks. The highest level will be on the compute node, and the lowest level will be the thread level on each CPU core. So in MPI jobs, they process the processes in the MPI jobs each communicate with each other across the network via message passing. So in MPI, essentially what you're doing is you're scattering variables across the hosts at a very, very fine level, within the kind of variable level. You can scatter across vectors across the nodes, do an operation on those variables, and then collect the data back. That's at a very fine level, but that requires very high speed interconnect across the network. So an example, I didn't have an example at such short notice for economics, but we have a program called GATK, which is the Genome Analysis Toolkit. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because of the kind of parameters it lets you configure. So I presume that there are similar applications in economics that you might use that has this kind of configuration ability. So things like the number of threads and the number of threads per call are parameters for controlling very fine granularity of parallelism. And GATK4 uses Spark for distributed multi-threaded, which is controlled in Java parameters that are passed to the Java application. So again, there must be economics applications that use Java, which might support parallelization at the thread level through Java. So set parameters according to allocated resources and HPC system architecture. So you can get some advice from the HPC team if you're running something that you really need to optimize for the architecture. Tip 10, identifying bottlenecks in your job. So when you run a HPC job, you typically get a job report. And the job report lets you identify resource utilization and potential bottlenecks. So what we really want, we want high percentage CPU utilization with low system usage, low percentage system usage, kind of ideal combination really. So typical bottlenecks are CPU bound. So if you find a CPU bound bottleneck, then you need to rewrite the algorithm for better efficiency. If you're facing a disk bound bottleneck, then use faster storage media. So perhaps SSD or cache data within the memory. That's something that Spark does. That was the iteration from Hadoop to Spark, was in-memory caching and lazy evaluation of the job. So Spark would, when you run a set of MapReduce operations in Spark, what Spark offered over Hadoop was that Spark could generate a directed acyclic graph of all the tasks to execute, and then it would cache them in memory and then do lazy evaluation of that directed acyclic graph to determine which order is best and most efficient to cache things in memory. But in terms of disk bound, I don't know if Scratch is SSD, it's probably typical physical hard disks, but perhaps then move things to SSD. Memory bound, if you're facing that, then increase the available memory or use faster memory. There might be, there's typically special nodes for large memory jobs, like big memQ, which the jobs run on machines which have larger memory. For network bound, that one's a tricky one because essentially the fabric of the interconnects between the nodes is fixed. You can't really change that easily. So the thing you can do is to minimize the traffic of running processes on the same host. But that would be something if you're facing network bound bottlenecks, then you'd have to discuss with HPC support to kind of work out what jobs are running in what nodes and see if they can be moved to other nodes to minimize processes where network bound bottlenecks are occurring. That's typically going to be something like MPI jobs where there's a lot of inter-process communication. So tools that can be useful are commands like time and perf for monitoring performance of programs executing in scripts with jobs, and workflow languages, which is going to be the next introduction in this presentation. Workflow languages have an execution engine that runs the jobs, that sits on top of the HPC platform and runs the jobs on the HPC, and that often produces a more detailed report, which is often in HTML and so very easy to read. That's very, very useful for optimizing jobs, because when you view the execution report, It's usually very detailed and easy to read. You get lots of graphs and things like that, rather than a text-based job report that you get from the HPC platform. I showed you that. Another thing is job arrays. Now, this is really useful if you've got thousands of small jobs, like my 97,000 job example I gave in my first slides. I wasn't aware of array jobs at that time, but array jobs allow you to group them all together so that the job scheduler can best decide how to execute the jobs, rather than just submitting them individually through a recursive script to the scheduler. If you provide them as a job array, then the scheduler uses its fair share policy to basically better optimize the jobs on the cluster, because these clusters are co-tenanted. You have other users running jobs at the same time. So job arrays are really a key way to go if you're running many jobs, hundreds to thousands of jobs. And actually, they're very easy to use. It's just basically you specify an array in the script. So tip 11, submit your jobs to the correct queues or partition in Slurm. So jobs are submitted to a queue for execution by the job scheduler. The default queue is used if one is specified. And different queues are available for similar job types, specific purposes, and resource requirements. So examples are short queue, medium queue, long queues, big num for large jobs, or particularly dedicated GPU queues. So using an incorrect queue can result in job termination. And the good thing about workflow languages, Nextflow is my particular favorite, is that they allow you to specify queues for pipeline steps, which means that you can have a main process that could run in a long queue and various spawned child processes that can run in the short queue. So you can have the main process running in the long queue. That's kind of like the overall manager of your series of jobs, if you've got that kind of computing requirement. So that's the sort of requirement we had in processing large number of genomes for viral insertions. We basically had a master job that would run in the long queue, and the long queue could have a job time of maybe months, weeks or months. And then the child jobs would get spawned into the relevant shorter queue. And that way, if a short job fails, your main overall job is still running the whole process. So you can go away and do other things. Tip 12, consider using a package manager. Package managers, for example, Conda, automate software installation, configuration, upgrading, and removal of packages. Included are distributions like Anaconda with data science packages and Conda for managing dependencies for programming environments. So, for example, if you want multiple versions of Python, you can do that quite easily in Conda. The only disadvantage of Conda from the HPC side is that when you create, if you've got lots of users creating Conda environments, because they can have multiple versions of Python, you end up with a lot of space being used on the storage. But there are a lot of benefits. I think those outweigh the disadvantages. So, for example, isolating and managing version dependencies for different projects ensures reproducibility by defining and pinning down specific versions in Conda environments, particularly in workflows. So when I worked in the Institute of Cancer Research, there were various different research groups. Some were doing very much research type work for cancer genomics, and others were doing very clinically based work where they had to give results back to patients through the Royal Marsden Hospital. So there were different requirements in terms of regulation. So the clinical work had to be more regulated. So if they used a bioinformatics tool, they would have to document it. It would have to be a particular version of the tool. So it's kind of like productionizing certain workflows. Sometimes you have a workflow where the particular version is not going to really impact much the research, but a particular version might impact the results for something that's diagnostic or something that's a lot of value is going to be placed on the results. In which case, by using a package manager and a workflow language, you can pin down specific versions of tools you're using in your workflow using YAML. Again, consult HPC documentation for package managers that are used on the system that you're using. Consider containerization. So containerization virtualizes operating systems environments by creating isolated user spaces, containers for running applications. Most popular are Docker and Singularity. So Singularity is preferred for HPC. If we had a larger audience, I would kind of ask why, but since we don't, so Singularity is preferred because it doesn't require root-owned container daemon. So the problem with Docker is the daemon that actually controls the Docker process needs to have root privileges so it can do things that might jeopardize security. So with Singularity, the user within a container has the same privileges as outside. So this uses single file-based images, supports multiple architectures, and integrates with HPC infrastructure. The typical use cases are applications built for different Linux distributions that can be containerized. Specific environments for workflows and pipelines. So if you've got a legacy pipeline that needs to run within a specific environment, that can be containerized. And running Singularity or Docker images without installation. Tip 14, use a workflow language for your pipeline. And this will be the subject of the second section of this presentation, which will be introductory. So workflow languages, some examples are WDL, Workflow Definition Language, CWL, which is Common Workflow Language, Nextflow, and SnakeMake. Although SnakeMake is used to build and define dependencies, but I think WDL, CWL, and Nextflow are fully fledged workflow languages, and they allow you to standardize and automate computational pipelines. So why would you use a workflow language? Well, there are a number of advantages. Specifically, is to address platform specificity, parallelism, dependencies, and error handling. And so workflow languages was something I introduced into the ICR, Institute of Cancer Research, when I was working there from 2018 to 2020. Although workflow languages now are kind of ubiquitous and common practice, it wasn't so common practice back then. And we had a lot of different different research groups using different computational pipelines, often written in outdated languages like Perl. So there was one researcher and his wife that built a pipeline, and then one of the partners left to a different institution, and then a lot of research groups copied that pipeline in Perl, but there was only one or two people in the whole of the Institute of Cancer Research who were very, who had skills in Perl. So there were a lot of copies of this pipeline that were being adapted, and some people had tried to rewrite it in Python, but it wasn't really standardized, and it made it very difficult to share the pipeline with different institutions. So if they run some analysis and then they wanted to share it with a different cancer research organization or with the CRIC, then it made it very difficult because there was a lack of interoperability. So workflow languages is a way to address that problem, as well as things like platform specificity, dependencies, and so forth. So you can enhance reproducibility because, as I said earlier, you can pin specific versions of software down that you're using in your economics pipeline. You might have particular tools that you want to use. There's platform agnosticism and abstraction. You can facilitate sharing and collaboration, and you can uphold general best practice for developing and running workflows. Tip 15 is the use of Jupyter Notebook in an interactive session. So run Jupyter Notebooks on HPC via Jupyter Hub or Open On Demand. So you were saying to us where the Jupyter Hub is?
Yes, it is on Myriad and also open on demand, I email people, they're looking for testers that I was
Oh, right.
talking about.
Yes.
So ARC is starting open
Right.
on demand.
Yeah.
And
But
Jupyter
Jupyter's
is
already,
there
yeah.
to test.
Yeah, so these some of these tips are from a few years back. So I think it's now everybody's adopting these things. You can manage environments using Conda and create kernels specific to projects. The benefits are interactive data exploration and visualization. It's user-friendly web interface, like we hope we'll see on the condenser. And it's an efficient use of HPC resources, cores, memories, GPUs, and enables a collaborative approach. So those are the 15 quick tips. And the next section is just a few slides introducing workflow languages for the standardization of pipelines. So the problem is the standardization of pipelines, which I was discussing. It can be a problem for some research groups. So pipelines are collections of workflows or execution tasks that couple data processing tasks and are ubiquitous in computational research. So different research groups may often use different technologies, workflow managers, shell scripting, or programming languages such as Bash, Perl, Python, etc. The problem with this approach is not the languages themselves, but it's the way the scripts and code base are organized. And this leads to a lack of standardization, which may result in poor interoperability, that is, being able to share your pipelines with others, either within the institute or external collaborators. Difficulties in reproducibility, specifically if you've got different versions of programs in your pipeline, where the version may change and you get a different result, that may or may not affect your research. It depends on the nature of the work. But yeah, reproducibility is the key thing in science. Really, is you want to have reproducibility, especially for paper publications, where nowadays when you publish a paper, you often submit the source code. Often, I'm sure that's also common in economics as well. And there's a challenge in distributing to other groups. Perhaps the pipeline you've written works brilliantly on Myriad, but with another system. That's why I advocate the use of workflow languages. And there's also duplication of effort, particularly with workflow languages now, as they've evolved. So workflow languages were not very commonly used. They were used by some research group, some organizations who already know about the cutting edge techniques. But now workflow languages are now quite ubiquitous and they're quite modular now. So that kind of covers the duplication of effort, because you can get modules written to do specific tasks that are already available from a code base, such as the Nextflow code bases that are online. And those approaches fail to demonstrate best practices. So the solution, as I've already mentioned, are workflow languages, domain-specific languages for writing workflows and pipelines that have application in a variety of fields. Astronomy, physics, bioinformatics, and economics are typical examples. I think this is an area where James Hetherington mentions he's somewhat of an expert, because I think he used to run software carpentry on domain-specific languages work. So they also typically use where HPC is employed, but it doesn't have to be with HPC. That's the beauty of a workflow language. You can write a pipeline that can run on your local machine, and then you can run it on HPC, and you don't need to change anything. You just need to change the configuration file where you can specify that you want more cores, you want more memory, and you run it on an HPC, and you just scale up your analysis very easily with very little change to the scripts. There are too many workflow languages to list, but the main contenders are, well, this was back in 2018, but I think not much has changed really, apart from the fact that Nextflow has become extremely popular. And back in 2018, when I was at the ICI and I was looking at workflow languages, I was deciding which one to use, which one would be good for the researchers to use. And there, a lot of them were molecular biologists and scientists who dabbled with programming, and some of them were quite skilled. But I found that Nextflow was amongst the easiest and the most powerful. So that was the one I recommended. So there's Nextflow, CWL, and WDL, which is what I mentioned those earlier. So WDL code is similar to Nextflow, but Nextflow is easy to use with LSF. But I've just put LSF there. I should have actually written LSF, Slurm, and Grid Engine. I think Myriad uses Grid Engine. Yeah. So Nextflow is very good with us, and it also works with AWS as well, especially useful when a lot of things are moving to cloud. A CWL is code structure similar to Nextflow and WDL, but it's not as readable. It's a bit more difficult to read and conceptualize. CWL does have a visual tool called Rabbix for designing workflows and generating CWL with a graphical user interface. I think it was popular some years back, but I don't think it's really taken off. I think Nextflow is the one that's accelerated in terms of adoption. So some advantages of Nextflow are for execution. As I mentioned, there's an executor that runs your pipeline. It runs it either on a local machine or on the infrastructure you provide, which may be cloud or HPC. And it abstracts away the execution platform, so you don't really need to write your code specifically for that platform or infrastructure. It supports things like Univer Grid Engine, which we use on Myriad, Platform LSF, which is quite popular by IBM, Slurm, PBS, and Tor. All of those are batch scheduled systems. I should have also wrote there that it also supports AWS and local machines. It's extremely easy to control parallelization. You can resume failed jobs through checkpoints, and that's extremely useful because if you have a set of batch scripts that you run on HPC, if anything goes wrong at a specific point in your pipeline in one particular script, then you have to debug all those job reports and find which line, print statements, debugging, all that. But you can resume failed jobs through checkpointing. So when you write your workflow language, you have process blocks. So you break your pipeline into steps, and each step is a process block where you can specify the resources. And the process block in Nextflow can either be written in Perl, Python, Bash. It can be written in any shebang interpreted language. And so if that point fails in your workflow, it's only that point that fails, and it will be logged very clearly in the job report that that's the bit that's failed. So it's very, very useful. And once you fix the issue, you can resume from that step because there's a cache of all the other inputs and outputs from all the upstream processes. It's easy to develop and maintain and deploy. In that way, you bring the compute to the data rather than you bring the data to the compute, which entails lots of network activity and is inefficient. By bringing the compute to the data, what we mean is we're running the code on the node where the files are, essentially, rather than moving about the inputs and outputs to different ways. For development, it standardizes inputs, outputs, and provides a framework. It encourages good methodology and best practice. As I said, workflow steps are defined in process blocks containing inputs, outputs, underlying code, and programming. And what you can do when you write code in Nextflow is you can take a Perl script that's from an old Linux pipeline. You can take the code and you can put it inside a process block, and the code is exactly the same. You just change the variable names of the inputs and outputs so that you can bind them to inputs and outputs of other processes, either upstream or downstream. Process blocks support Python, Bash, Perl, whatever other shebang defined interpreter, as I was saying. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jimmy.